Hi there everyone, Michael Beresford here from OpenCorp, back for this week's edition of Conversations with Matt Lewison, the OpenCorp CEO. Louis, great to have you down in Melbourne again.
Good to be here.
Awesome. Now, I know from having known you for about 25 years that you love urban planning and design and stats and why things happen and how cities are designed. What I want to bring it back to is the number one rule of property that I've been implementing for 20 years myself and you for even longer, and that is that land appreciates and buildings depreciate. So it's why we look at land-based investments. Clearly in Cam's book, My 4-Year-Old the Property Investor, we talk about it a lot. Cam talks about it a lot. Why does land appreciate?
I think we all know the golden rule, don't we, in economics about supply and demand.
Right.
We always look at another in affordability being a key metric as well, or one of the fundamentals that drive price growth. But supply and demand are pretty much the overarching for most products and services. And it really comes down to supply. And I guess when you look at Australia, and this is where a lot of people perhaps get confused because they look at Australia, big landmass, very small kind of urban area, and go, but there's an abundance of land. And I think the key that they need to understand is how land gets used, and convenience and amenity is critical. And I mean, it was something that when I started working in land development and planning out master planned estates as well, I mean, I just fell in love with that concept of, and that learning as much as I could about it, because it's also that amenity element that if you went and built 10,000 lots out in the middle of nowhere, no one's going to move there. It's not the field of dreams that if you build it, they will come. If there's nothing there. So areas actually go through a life cycle as well, and it can be multi-tiered life cycle. So there's things that you have to do to create drivers of amenity to bring people in, and different layers to add to the community. If you have a housing estate with no shops, I mean, do people want to live in it? If you have shops with no housing, are the shops going to survive? And obviously schools and all those things, they need a critical mass. So it's incredibly complex. But again, that's one of the things that makes it so exciting and so interesting, and why there's predictability in the way that areas evolve and develop, and why prices and rents evolve and develop with those different levels of amenity. But if I really take it back to like its core principle about supply and demand, and I think we all have our state governments to thank for, I guess, some of the price growth we've experienced as investors in the last, particularly the last 20 years, in fact 18, since they created a concept called the urban growth boundary. Yep. And they took what was maybe in principle an abundant supply and made it a constrained supply. And then they also added layers to their planning schemes that made it harder and more complex to actually develop properties. When I first started in land development, if a developer had sufficient land size, they could go outside of kind of the existing urban form, and they could build the infrastructure. So they would plan out their estates. And obviously if they had 10,000 lots to develop, then they understood they're not going to sell a single lot unless they got that amenity right, but also made it something that people wanted. So the amenity grows the demand. But they've got to spend a lot of money to create the infrastructure to get out there. So they might build a big stretch of road, and they put in the pipes, and they create their new community. And then there's backfill between that new estate that might have been 3 or 5 kilometres outside of the existing urban form. And obviously the areas in between become backfilled. Mm-hmm. And state governments decided they didn't like that. And local councils in particular didn't like it because of the investment they had to make in maintenance of those roads once they were built and handed over, and the space in between. So they said, we want it all to happen in an orderly fashion. So wonderful in principle. And then they also really kind of perhaps saw that there was more fragmented land ownership other than those big estates. So they said, oh, well, if we're going to see this fragmented land ownership get developed, we need to create a process. And they obviously created precincts that could be rezoned all at once. And again, we thank them for the principle of that. But essentially what they did was added years to the planning process, added extra costs to the planning process, because then they started saying, well, we can't rely on any one developer to build this big bit of infrastructure. Everybody needs to chip in, and they try to negotiate with 30 different landowners to work out how much each person, each developer contributes. And they then try to get it delivered sequentially. And the result is it's a complete nightmare in many cases. The benefit of it is for us as investors, though, is that they've further constrained the land supply. It's a really great example. As you know, we developed a site out in Greenvale a couple of years ago, and that was in a small precinct of Greenvale Central, which is one of Melbourne's northern suburbs. It was a backfill area. And there was about 50 properties to develop, the biggest of which was only about 4 hectares to 5 hectares. So it could accommodate under 100 lots on its own.
Right.
Wasn't huge, but you needed to spend millions of dollars in infrastructure to get to that parcel of land. But no other parcel of land could be developed until that one was actually developed. So it literally held up 10,000 lots for one little land parcel. Following that, there was obviously other constraints on other land holdings. So we see this, and again, you look from the top down and you go, look at all this land, but the reality is that it can only be developed in a certain order, like a jigsaw puzzle. You kind of start with certain pieces first. It helps to build it out. And knowing that process, knowing those constraints, knowing the players involved in the decision-making process and their costs that they incur and develop is really important to understand and predict where the price growth is going to occur, where rental growth is going to occur, when it's going to accelerate, for forces outside of just interest rates going up or down or wages. There's other things that obviously influence that supply and demand. And as I said, I think it's been one of the most exciting parts of my career, and one of the things I'm most passionate about is kind of that interplay between the forces that drive price growth, and also I love seeing cities evolve and suburbs evolve and how they change over time.
Yeah, it's I'm using Greenvale as an example. It's a great supply and demand story. You know, we were clients of ours were buying out there in around 2014. Prices were 460 to 500k depending on land size. Those same properties today are 830 to 920 depending on land size, and that's in what's that, 8 years. So some amazing returns just on one property before you think about the ability to compound and grow from there. But I remember it. So it was around 2000. I just finished uni, and a friend of mine bought out in Narre Warren North. So about 10 minutes down the freeway from where we grew up. Headed down there to check out the house, and it was about a 400 square metre block and a single story, 4-bed, 2-bath, double lock-up garage house that had just been built. And there was like mud everywhere, and there weren't the shops and the schools in yet. Anyway, that she paid $203,000 for that. You think about what that area is worth now. It's some areas pushing $1 million. So, but at the time, it seemed like the very edge of Melbourne. And back in the old office, remember we had the maps of Melbourne up, and I looked at it one day. I'm like, hang on a second. I measured it from the CBD to Narre Warren was halfway to where the new growth areas were happening in Melbourne. So in 20 years, only 20 years, it had basically expanded that much further out. And so when you were talking about the urban growth boundary, was the reason that was implemented purely as a way of constraining spend on infrastructure because infrastructure is so expensive?
Infrastructure and maintenance, yeah. Obviously the burden, and I studied civil engineering, and I remember in one of our subjects we actually had, I think it was one of the state, an engineer from one of the state controlled organisations or infrastructure companies, and they came out to talk about the replacement costs. So we looked at road maintenance, how frequently you have to replace road surfaces. We looked at pipes, we looked at all sorts of things, and obviously there's key infrastructure as well, things like sewage treatment plants and like water supply. And so they obviously know that certain things have a huge cost to build new ones, like it costs an absolute bomb to build a new sewage treatment plant and redirect pipes to kind of. So they have to make the most of that major infrastructure, and they actually want higher density. And the only way they could get higher density is to put a ring around the city. And they actually had targets. It was about 65% of all new development they wanted to come from units. Right. That's townhouses and apartments. Again, let's thank local councils because I'm sure we've all heard of the NIMBYs, not in my backyard, because it's all great at state planning level and federal planning level to say, yep, we all support higher densification because let's make the most of the infrastructure we've got. But the reality is that people don't want high density in their neighbourhood. Until their child, even when they're children, I guess, can't afford to live in the area, they still think like density is bad. And a quick, like a little stat. So I think it was Mervac years and years ago did research, this is probably in the 2000s, but I assume it's still current, into who their customers were when they were building land estates. And they worked out 90% of all people that live in a land estate have moved from within 7 kilometres. And it makes sense. You've got your support network, your high school, your childhood friends, your family, your babysitters. Now, sometimes people, obviously, when they're mobile, they go to uni in town and maybe they meet somebody from the other side of town, but you end up settling near one of those families for that support network. So you tend to find, obviously, where there's an existing cluster of property or of housing and amenity, that people kind of stay in that precinct. They don't just move to the city where there's apartments. They want to live near their family, and they want probably closer to what they had as children. So we do find that the higher density is often filled by students. It's also often filled by people who have moved from overseas because they don't have that existing family network and they want to be close to amenity. And then also we're seeing some of the downsizers that are moving kind of to areas. There's a bit of a city change, maybe not to the high density stuff in the city, but certainly city fringe areas where there's really premium apartments and they're spending $2 million to live near the best restaurants in the city. But families almost unanimously tend to live in those areas where they grew up. So it's predictable now. We know that boundary's there and they haven't been moving it. And because they're not moving it, obviously that's putting more and more pressure on pricing. We've probably heard of the term land banking, and I know it's a bit of a dirty word that newspapers really try to push to suggest that land developers land bank. Certainly they have land banks, but they don't deliberately land bank. Now, if you kind of keep in mind, developers exist to make a profit. You only make a profit from selling something. If they can develop something and make a profit, they will develop and make a profit. The reason they don't is that they get held up by councils, they get held up by sometimes costs, and they go, well, I can't make a profit right now, so I'm going to wait until I can make a profit. They get held up by contractors who are busy on other jobs. And we've seen that in the last year as well, that contractors are just refusing to price jobs at the moment because they go, we're busy, we don't want to take on work we can't do, so you either have to pay us a premium to do it or we won't even price. So yeah, all those things kind of further constrain that supply of new housing. And coming back to I guess something I said earlier, and you touched on it around Narre North, where when your friends bought in there was almost nothing. And again, it comes back to that evolution of an area. And it was something I learned, there's a big housing estate, master planned estate I developed in Queensland a few years ago, and we gave money to council to build a road in between that suburb, which was the pits, and it wasn't very well regarded when we started our estate. There was a suburb nearby that was much there was a huge premium and it was really well considered, and somebody said they lived in that area, and I go, oh, that's great. And it was literally a kilometre between the two as the crow flies, but to drive it was a 5 kilometre drive through an industrial estate. Council had this plan to build this road, and we said, we'll give you $3.5 million if you build it now, not in 10 years. Mm-hmm. And they built that road, and within 3 months of that road finishing, the land price went up about 20% and house prices went up 10%. because of the convenience that we'd added to that estate. We'd shortened the drive to work. If people worked closer to the city, we'd shorten that drive by about 7 to 10 minutes in peak hour. So when you come to these areas, and again, that's one of the things that it's important for people to realise, is that getting in early, sometimes before the amenity is there, can actually be advantageous as well, because you know that the amenity is going to come in layers. When you get to that kind of critical mass, then the shops will come in. That'll add value. Then when you get to the next critical mass, the quality of, there might be private schools start, or the shops improve. You see social infrastructure and more roads and better roads, which continues to add value to that area. So yeah, it's it's not a linear pathway with housing and house prices, but we know, as I said, that the supply constraints are going to continue to drive up prices, and we know that those other things, the amenity, will increase demand over time as well.
Just talking about, I guess, prices going up and limiting supply, the last question I've got for you today, you hear a lot of property commentators talking about house prices, and the way to fix the unaffordable housing market is to create more supply. But they always qualify that and say that you can't just kind of click your fingers and bring stock to market. It sounds like it's all of those layers of red tape or the approval process that's required. Is it possible for them to reform all of that, do you think, or is there so much kind of detail and process in there, it's kind of in the too hard basket, and they'll prefer to grant people money to try and help them get started?
Oh gee, what an awesome question. Would it be advantageous? I'll start with, is it worthwhile reforming that, and will it make a difference? If they reformed the process and the red tape, they could make a small difference. And it won't happen in the next, there'd be no change in the next 12 to 18 months. Those changes might start to have a benefit beyond 18 months, but it would be incremental. They're not going to remove the urban growth boundary. They might shift it. There's a whole heap of politics involved in that. And it can be political dynamite to deal with it, because they are. I mean, again, if I use Melbourne as the example, because we're here today, there's parts of Melbourne that you can't develop because of endangered moth species that live in a grass, and that moth species is the principal food for I think it's like certain type of the growling grass frog or something like that. And so when you look outside the existing urban growth boundary, there's a whole heap of environmental considerations that come into play, as well as where does it make sense from an engineering perspective to develop. So that's kind of fraught with danger. And even if they shifted the urban growth boundary, then it just goes into a precinct structure planning process that's going to take 5 to 10 years. In fact, there's one in Brisbane, up in Caboolture West, the northern suburbs of Brisbane. And we were looking at land in Caboolture West in 2005, and it was planned to be the next precinct to go through. They're still working through the planning 17 years later. So it can take a huge amount of time because of all the stakeholder involvement, trying not to, I guess, do anything that's going to cost them votes at local government or state government as well. So is it worthwhile, and could it happen? I mean, I guess the other part of where it could change would be in the delivery of more density. So it's actually, in theory, it's easier to plan and change the planning to create more density. And councils kind of do some weird stuff there. In Queensland, for instance, in Brisbane, the local council almost outlawed townhouse infill development about 3 years ago. So whereas state government wants more density, local council said, oh, we're losing votes because ratepayers don't like the extra cars on the road in the neighbourhood, so we're going to make townhouse development harder. In the last 18 months, they've also said we don't like to see cars on the street around apartment developments, so we're going to increase the number of cars that car parks are required in any apartment development. So in doing that, they've increased the requirement. It actually adds $100,000 per dwelling to the cost of constructing.
Right. Expensive car park.
expensive car park. Now, more recently, the Victorian government, in their infinite wisdom, has decided that they think that all houses should be 7-star energy rating, not 6-star like the rest of the country. And that's going to add $30,000 to $50,000 to the cost of building a dwelling as well. So should they change? Yes. Will they change? I think it's unlikely. They seem to be going the opposite direction, completely unaware or oblivious to the fact that these things push up the cost of construction. How does that affect homeowners and property investors? Something I learned a long time ago is, again, that interplay between the replacement cost of a dwelling and the price of the established market. So as the replacement cost goes up, and that's the cost of land goes up, the cost of building goes up, the established housing market goes up. And so they're adding all these barriers to entry, which constrains supply in the future, makes it less affordable in certain areas to build new, which means that obviously there's a more focus on the established market, and that's driving prices up, as well as obviously, again, this is, got to love governments, because they're stimulating first home buyer activity through First Homeowners Grant, the First Home Loan Guarantee Scheme, and discounts or waivers of stamp duty to encourage more first home buyers. They're saying we want more supply of housing. It's affordable and it needs to be under this price barrier of, what is it, 700 to 850,000, depending on which city it's in or where it is. So they're encouraging demand, but they're restricting supply. Thank you, government. I've got a lot to be grateful for, as we all do if we're property investors. And look, we can only predict that it's going to continue to evolve in that way.
Absolutely. So plenty of meat in this week's episode of Conversations with Matt. Matt, thanks for your insights. I learned some stuff today. Always do when we chat. But I guess rule number one, land depreciates, buildings depreciate. Make sure you got land-based investments. Play the long game, and thanks, government. We'll see you next week.